The Mississippi River ran crimson under the April sun of 1863. But it wasn't blood that stained its waters, it was the reflection of Confederate flags. Fluttering defiantly from the bluffs of Vicksburg, Major General Ulysses Simpson Grant stood on the deck of his flagship, studying the seemingly impregnable fortress through his field glasses. The city perched on its high bluffs like a medieval castle, its cannons commanding every approach along the great river. What Grant couldn't see from his position were the eyes already watching him, Union spies, who had been operating in the shadows of Vicksburg for months. Among the bustling crowds of Vicksburg's market square, a woman in a plain brown dress moved. With practiced invisibility, Emma Edmonds, operating under the alias Frank Thompson, had successfully infiltrated Confederate lines weeks earlier. Her reports, smuggled out through a network of loyal slaves and Union sympathizers, painted a detailed picture of the city's defenses that would prove invaluable to Grant's campaign. The intelligence network that would ultimately decide the fate of Vicksburg had been years in the making. African-American contraband slaves, freed by advancing Union forces, formed the backbone of this shadow army. They moved freely through Confederate territory, their intimate knowledge of local geography and social networks making them perfect intelligence assets. These brave men and women risked everything to provide Union commanders with the information they desperately needed. Colonel Benjamin Henry Grierson, preparing for what would become known as Grierson's Raid, relied heavily on these intelligence reports. His scouts had identified weaknesses in Confederate supply lines and troop movements that conventional reconnaissance would never have revealed. The preliminary intelligence suggested that a bold cavalry strike deep into Mississippi could create the diversion Grant needed for his audacious river crossing. As twilight descended over the Confederate stronghold, signal fires flickered from hidden positions along the river bank. These weren't random flames, they were part of an elaborate communication system developed by Union intelligence operatives. Each pattern of light conveyed specific information about troop movements, supply shipments, and offensive preparations. Within the city, Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison Wilson, Grant's chief intelligence officer, had spent months developing this network of informants. His operatives included riverboat pilots who knew every sandbar and current, merchants who observed supply movements, and even Confederate soldiers disillusioned with their cause. The web of information flowing to Union headquarters was more comprehensive than any intelligence operation the war had yet seen. The challenge facing Grant wasn't just military, it was logistical and psychological. Vicksburg had withstood previous Union assaults, earning a reputation for invincibility that extended far beyond its physical defenses. The Confederate garrison, commanded by Lieutenant General John Clifford Pemberton, believed their position was unassailable. This confidence, however, would prove to be their greatest vulnerability. This historical context draws upon documented intelligence operations, as recorded in the official records of the War of the Rebellion and corroborated by the National Archives. Civil War military records, deep within the Confederate lines, another Union operative was gathering crucial intelligence. Charles Davis, a former slave who had escaped to Union lines months earlier, had volunteered to return to enemy territory as a spy. His reports detailed the exact positions of Confederate artillery, batteries, the condition of their ammunition supplies, and most importantly, the growing food shortages within the besieged city. The stage was set for one of the most complex military operations of the Civil War, where victory would depend not just on courage and firepower, but on the invisible war fought by spies, scouts, and intelligence operatives whose names would largely be forgotten by history. The morning of April 16, 1863, dawned with an unusual fog rolling off the Mississippi River, providing perfect cover for the most audacious deception of the Vicksburg campaign. Grant's plan to move his army below Vicksburg required naval support, but Admiral David Dixon Porter's gunboats would have to run the gauntlet of Confederate batteries. The success of this operation depended entirely on intelligence gathered by Union spies about the timing and positioning of enemy artillery crews. Emma Edmonds, still operating under her male alias, had spent the previous week observing Confederate gun crews from her position as a Confederate soldier. Her detailed reports revealed that the rebel gunners followed predictable patterns, with reduced manning during late evening hours and a tendency to concentrate fire on the largest targets. First, this intelligence would prove crucial when Porter's fleet made their desperate run past the Vicksburg batteries. The network of contraband slaves working as Union informants had identified a critical weakness in Confederate intelligence. Their Commanders consistently underestimated the capabilities and loyalty of the African American population. Former slave Dabney, who worked as a servant in the Confederate headquarters, was able to observe strategic planning sessions and relay information through an ingenious system of laundry signals, visible from Union positions across the river. Colonel Grierson's cavalry had begun their diversionary raid through central Mississippi, guided by detailed intelligence about Confederate troop dispositions. The scout reports provided by local Unionists and escaped slaves allowed Grierson to avoid major Confederate concentrations while striking at vulnerable supply lines. Every bridge destroyed, every telegraph line cut was the result of precise intelligence about Confederate logistics networks. Lieutenant Colonel Wilson's intelligence operations had uncovered something even more valuable than troop movements: the psychological state of Vicksburg's defenders. Reports from multiple sources indicated growing concerns about food supplies and civilian morale. Confederate soldiers were writing letters home expressing doubts about their ability to hold the city indefinitely. These intercepted communications revealed that the supposedly impregnable fortress had very human vulnerabilities. The Union spy network had also identified key Confederate informants and turned several of them into double agents. A Confederate courier named Matthews, captured during Grierson's raid, had been successfully recruited to carry false information back to his commanders. The disinformation campaign that followed would convince Confederate leadership that Grant's main assault would come from the north, leading them to reinforce the wrong positions. As Porter's gunboats prepared for their nighttime run past Vicksburg, Union intelligence operatives positioned along the river bank prepared to provide real-time information about Confederate responses. Signal fires and mirror flashes would communicate enemy artillery positions and the effectiveness of Confederate countermeasures. The coordination between naval forces and land-based intelligence represented a new level of military sophistication. The psychological warfare component of the intelligence campaign was equally sophisticated. Union operatives spread rumors about the size of Grant's army, the effectiveness of Union artillery, and the inevitability of Vicksburg's fall. These rumors, carefully planted and allowed to spread naturally through Confederate ranks, began to erode the confidence that had sustained the city's defenders through previous sieges. On the night of the naval bombardment, Charles Davis positioned himself near the Confederate artillery emplacements, ready to signal the locations of enemy guns to Union forces across the river. His courage in maintaining this exposed position under heavy fire exemplified the dedication of the intelligence operatives who made Grant's campaign possible. The success of Porter's fleet in running the Vicksburg batteries was attributed to superior firepower and naval skill, but the truth was more complex. Every Confederate gun position had been identified and mapped by Union spies. Every weakness in the enemy's defensive coordination had been noted and exploited. The Gibraltar of the Confederacy was beginning to crack, not from external pressure alone, but from the internal intelligence war that most of its defenders never knew was being fought. The pre-dawn hours of April 30th, 1863, found Grant's army poised at Hard Times Landing, 30 miles below Vicksburg. The audacious plan to cross the Mississippi River at Grand Gulf depended entirely on intelligence gathered by Union operatives about Confederate defensive positions. What appeared to be a straightforward amphibious assault was actually the culmination of months of careful reconnaissance and espionage. Scout reports from freed slaves who had worked on Confederate fortifications revealed that the Grand Gulf batteries were positioned to command the river approach, but had significant blind spots on their flanks. This intelligence, gathered at tremendous personal risk by men whose names were never recorded in official dispatches, would determine the success or failure of Grant's entire campaign. Emma Edmonds had infiltrated the Confederate garrison at Grand Gulf weeks earlier, posing as a Confederate nurse. Her detailed sketches of gun positions, ammunition storage areas, and garrison strength provided Grant's staff with intelligence that conventional reconnaissance could never have obtained. The maps she smuggled out through the Underground Railroad network were more accurate than any official Confederate military documents. The network of African American spies had identified a crucial weakness in Confederate river defenses: the reliance on oppressed slave labor for construction and maintenance. Many of these workers had been recruited as Union informants, providing real-time intelligence about defensive preparations. When Confederate engineers reinforced certain positions, Union headquarters knew about it within hours. Admiral Porter's gunboats, now positioned below Vicksburg, coordinated their bombardment of Grand Gulf with precise intelligence about Confederate ammunition supplies. Union spies had reported that the rebel garrison was rationing artillery shells, making sustained bombardment inadvisable for the defenders. This information allowed Porter to maintain pressure on the batteries while minimizing risk to his own fleet. The psychological component of the intelligence war reached its peak. During the Grand Gulf bombardment, Confederate soldiers, already demoralized by reports of Union strength and their own supply shortages, began to question whether their positions could be held. Letters intercepted by Union intelligence revealed a growing sense of isolation and abandonment among the defenders. Lieutenant Colonel Wilson had developed an intricate system for coordinating intelligence from multiple sources. Reports from spies, scouts, escaped slaves, and loyal civilians were cross-referenced and verified before being passed to operational commanders. This systematic approach to intelligence analysis was revolutionary for its time and provided Grant with an unprecedented understanding of enemy capabilities and intentions. The decision to abandon the direct assault on Grand Gulf and instead land at Bruinsburg was based entirely on intelligence provided by local civilians. A Confederate deserter, recruited by Union operatives, revealed that the landing site was lightly defended and that roads leading inland were suitable for rapid troop movement. This information transformed what could have been a costly frontal assault into a successful flanking maneuver. As Grant's army began crossing the Mississippi at Bruinsburg, Union spies were already operating behind Confederate lines, mapping defensive positions and identifying supply routes. The speed of the Union advance would depend not just on the courage of the soldiers, but on the detailed intelligence about terrain and enemy dispositions that had been gathered over preceding months. The Confederate response to Grant's landing was hampered by their own intelligence failures. General Pemberton, isolated in Vicksburg and dependent on unreliable communications, had been fed false information by Union double agents about the size and direction of Grant's movement. The confusion this created among Confederate commanders would prove decisive in the coming battles. Charles Davis, operating deep in Confederate territory, had established contact with Union forces advancing inland from Bruinsburg. His reports about Confederate troop movements and supply lines allowed Grant to move with confidence through unfamiliar territory. The intelligence network that had made the river crossing possible was now guiding the Army toward its ultimate objective. The success of Grant's landing at Bruinsburg was celebrated as a triumph of military planning and execution, but the unsung heroes were the spies and informants who had made it possible. Their courage and sacrifice had transformed the Gibraltar of the Confederacy from an impregnable fortress into a target that could be approached, surrounded, and ultimately conquered. The morning of May 1st, 1863, saw Grant's army advancing rapidly inland from their successful Mississippi River crossing, but their swift progress owed as much to superior intelligence as to military prowess. The network of Union spies and scouts had mapped every road, identified every Confederate outpost, and assessed the loyalty of every civilian community between the river and Vicksburg. Emma Edmonds, now operating behind Confederate lines in her original identity as a woman, had established a safe-house network among Union sympathizers in the Mississippi countryside. These civilians, many of them quietly opposed to the Confederate cause, provided shelter for Union operatives and served as communication links between scattered intelligence assets. Their reports revealed that Confederate General John Bowen's forces at Port Gibson were smaller and less well supplied than official estimates suggested. The Battle of Port Gibson on May 1st demonstrated the tactical advantages of superior intelligence. Union forces, guided by detailed reconnaissance reports, were able to outflank Confederate positions that had been surveyed weeks earlier by African-American scouts. The Confederate defenders, fighting on terrain they thought they knew better than their enemies, discovered that Grant's army possessed more accurate maps of the battlefield than they did. Local civilians, many of them slaves or former slaves, had provided Union intelligence with detailed information about Confederate supply lines and communication networks. When Confederate forces retreated from Port Gibson, Union operatives were already positioned to observe their withdrawal routes and report on their destinations. This real-time intelligence allowed Grant to maintain pressure on retreating enemy forces while avoiding potential ambushes. The speed of Grant's advance toward Jackson, the Mississippi state capital, was made possible by intelligence reports that had identified weak points in Confederate defenses throughout central Mississippi. Union spies had mapped the railroad networks that supplied Confederate forces and identified the key junctions whose capture would cripple enemy logistics. The capture of Jackson on May 14th was as much an intelligence victory as a military one. Historical documentation of these intelligence operations can be found in the memoirs of Union officers and in post-war testimonies recorded by the Freedmen's Bureau, as preserved in the National Archives. Lieutenant Colonel Wilson's intelligence staff had developed a comprehensive picture of Confederate command structure and decision-making processes. Reports from double agents and intercepted communications revealed that General Joseph Eggleston Johnston, commanding Confederate forces in Mississippi, was operating with incomplete information about Union strength and intentions. This intelligence advantage allowed Grant to anticipate and counter Confederate strategic responses. The psychological warfare component of Union intelligence operations reached new levels of sophistication during the inland campaign. Rumors about the size of Grant's army, carefully planned by Union operatives, had convinced many Confederate commanders that they faced overwhelming odds. Confederate soldiers, already concerned about their families' welfare and their own supply situation, began deserting in increasing numbers. Charles Davis had established a network of communication posts along Grant's line of advance, using African American civilians and contraband slaves as couriers. This system allowed Union commanders to coordinate movements across a wide front, while maintaining constant awareness of Confederate responses. The intelligence flowing through this network was more timely and accurate than anything Confederate forces could obtain about Union movements. The Battle of Champion Hill on May 16th became a decisive engagement, partly because Union forces possessed detailed intelligence about Confederate positions and troop strengths. Emma Edmonds, operating as a battlefield observer, had provided real-time reports about Confederate artillery positions and reserves. Her information allowed Union commanders to concentrate their attacks on the weakest points of the Confederate line. Confederate General Pemberton's retreat toward Vicksburg was observed and reported by Union intelligence operatives who had been positioned along potential withdrawal routes weeks in advance. The speed and coordination of the Union pursuit reflected not just military efficiency, but the comprehensive intelligence preparation that had preceded every engagement of the campaign. As Grant's army approached the outer defenses of Vicksburg, the intelligence network that had guided them from the Mississippi River to the gates of the city prepared for its greatest challenge. The siege of the Gibraltar of the Confederacy would test every aspect of the Union intelligence apparatus that had been so carefully constructed over the preceding months. The inland campaign had demonstrated that modern warfare required more than courage and firepower. It demanded comprehensive intelligence about enemy capabilities, intentions, and vulnerabilities. The Union Army approaching Vicksburg was guided by knowledge that made their tactical and strategic decisions more effective than those of their Confederate opponents. The morning of May 19, 1863, marked the beginning of what would become one of the most intensive intelligence operations of the American Civil War. As Grant's army settled into siege positions around Vicksburg, the city's 4,000 to 7,000 Confederate defenders and civilians found themselves isolated not just physically, but informationally. The Union intelligence network that had guided the army to Vicksburg's gates now turned its attention to the city's internal conditions and defensive capabilities. Emma Edmonds, having successfully maintained her cover throughout the inland campaign, now faced her most dangerous assignment. The siege lines made movement between Union and Confederate positions extremely hazardous, but her intelligence was crucial for understanding the effectiveness of the Union bombardment and the morale of Vicksburg's defenders. Using a network of signals and dead drops, she continued to provide detailed reports about Confederate artillery positions and ammunition supplies. The psychological warfare aspects of the siege were as important as the physical bombardment. Union intelligence operatives, working through Confederate deserters and civilian refugees, spread carefully crafted rumors about the hopelessness of Vicksburg's situation. These psychological operations, coordinated by Lieutenant Colonel Wilson's staff, were designed to accelerate the collapse of Confederate morale and encourage surrenders. African American scouts, many of them former slaves from the Vicksburg area, provided Union commanders with detailed knowledge of the city's topography and infrastructure. Their reports identified potential weak points in Confederate defenses, locations of ammunition storage facilities, and the routes used by Confederate supply parties attempting to maintain contact with the outside world. This local knowledge proved invaluable for planning both bombardments and potential assault operations. The Union intelligence network had identified several Confederate attempts to establish communication with relief forces outside the siege perimeter. These intelligence breaches were systematically exploited, with Union operatives intercepting messages and sometimes replacing them with false information, designed to mislead Confederate commanders about the timing and strength of potential relief operations. Charles Davis, operating within the Confederate lines, reported on the devastating effects of the Union bombardment on both military and civilian morale. His observations revealed that the constant shelling was more psychologically effective than militarily decisive, as Confederate positions were too well constructed to be easily destroyed by artillery fire. However, the civilian population was showing signs of serious stress, with food shortages becoming increasingly severe. The siege created new opportunities for intelligence gathering, as Confederate deserters began crossing Union lines in increasing numbers. Each deserter was carefully debriefed by Wilson's intelligence staff, providing updated information about defensive positions, ammunition supplies, and the morale of specific Confederate units. This human intelligence was cross-referenced with observations from Union spies still operating within the city. Union operatives had established a comprehensive monitoring system for Confederate supply efforts. Every attempt to run supplies into Vicksburg was observed and reported, allowing Union forces to intercept most relief efforts. The intelligence network's effectiveness in disrupting Confederate logistics contributed significantly to the deteriorating conditions within the besieged city. The coordination between Union artillery and intelligence operations reached unprecedented levels during the siege. Spies within Vicksburg provided real-time targeting information for Union batteries, identifying the locations of Confederate ammunition dumps, headquarters facilities, and troop concentrations. This intelligence-directed bombardment was far more effective than random shelling would have been. Emma Edmonds reported that Confederate engineers were working desperately to strengthen their defensive positions, but were hampered by shortages of materials and the constant Union bombardment. Her detailed sketches of Confederate engineering efforts allowed Union commanders to anticipate and counter enemy defensive improvements. The intelligence war was becoming as important as the physical siege. Lieutenant Colonel Wilson's intelligence summary for late May revealed that Confederate morale within Vicksburg was deteriorating more rapidly than expected. Reports from multiple sources indicated that civilian food supplies were nearly exhausted and that Confederate soldiers were beginning to question their commanders' assurances about relief operations. The intelligence suggested that the siege might succeed sooner than Grant's staff had originally estimated. The intelligence operations during the early stages of the Vicksburg siege demonstrated how information warfare had evolved during the Civil War. The comprehensive intelligence network that surrounded the Confederate stronghold was gathering and analyzing information with a sophistication that would not be matched again. Until the 20th century, the fate of Vicksburg was being decided as much by spies and scouts as by soldiers and artillery. By the first week of June 1863, the intelligence war surrounding Vicksburg had reached a level of intensity that matched the physical siege itself. The Union spy network, now operating with remarkable sophistication, had penetrated virtually every aspect of Confederate operations within the besieged city. Emma Edmonds, having established herself as an indispensable source of real-time intelligence, reported that civilian conditions had deteriorated beyond what Confederate authorities were willing to acknowledge publicly. The psychological operations component of the siege had evolved into a comprehensive campaign designed to break Confederate will to resist. Union intelligence operatives, working through Confederate deserters and civilian contacts, had begun spreading detailed accounts of the hopelessness of Vicksburg's situation. These carefully crafted messages, based on accurate intelligence about conditions within the city, were more effective than crude propaganda because they contained enough truth to be credible. Charles Davis, still operating within Confederate lines despite increasing security measures, provided crucial intelligence about the effectiveness of Union bombardment operations. His reports revealed that while Confederate military positions remained largely intact, the constant shelling was having a devastating effect on civilian morale and on the ability of Confederate forces to maintain normal operations. Supply distribution had become erratic, and many civilian areas were experiencing severe shortages of food and medical supplies. The Union intelligence network had identified and begun exploiting a critical weakness In Confederate operations, the reliance on civilian labor for maintaining defensive positions. Many of the civilians impressed for this work were Union sympathizers or slaves, who had no loyalty to the Confederate cause. These workers provided detailed intelligence about Confederate engineering projects, ammunition storage locations, and the deployment of artillery pieces. Lieutenant Colonel Wilson's intelligence staff had developed a comprehensive assessment of Confederate command effectiveness within Vicksburg. Reports from multiple sources indicated that General Pemberton was struggling to maintain coordination between his various unit commanders, and that disagreements about strategy were becoming increasingly common. This intelligence about Confederate command dysfunction would prove valuable for timing Union operations to maximum advantage. The siege had created new opportunities for signals intelligence, as Confederate forces became increasingly dependent on visual communications within the city. Union observers, positioned in elevated positions around the siege perimeter, had learned to interpret Confederate signal patterns and were able to anticipate enemy movements and responses. This signals intelligence capability represented a significant technological advancement in military intelligence operations. Union spies had reported that Confederate attempts to establish contact with relief forces were becoming increasingly desperate and poorly coordinated. General Johnston's forces, operating outside the siege perimeter, were receiving incomplete and often contradictory information about conditions within Vicksburg. This intelligence isolation of the Confederate garrison was as effective as the physical blockade in ensuring the city's eventual surrender. Emma Edmonds provided detailed intelligence about the locations and capabilities of Confederate sharpshooters who had been inflicting casualties on Union forces. Her reports allowed Union commanders to develop effective countermeasures and to position their own sharpshooters to neutralize the Confederate threat. The deadly game of sniper warfare was being influenced by superior intelligence as much as by marksmanship skills. The intelligence network had identified several potential weak points in Confederate defenses that could be exploited if Grant decided to attempt an assault rather than continue the siege. These assessments, based on detailed reconnaissance and intelligence from sources within the city, provided operational alternatives that would not have been available without comprehensive intelligence preparation. African American intelligence operatives, working at tremendous personal risk, had established communication links with slave communities within Vicksburg. These contacts provided intelligence about civilian morale, food supplies, and the effectiveness of Confederate efforts to maintain order within the city. The intelligence flowing through these networks revealed that the city's social fabric was beginning to unravel under the pressure of the siege. The coordination between intelligence operations and military planning had reached unprecedented levels of sophistication. Every Union artillery bombardment was guided by current intelligence about Confederate positions and activities. Every adjustment in siege tactics was based on comprehensive assessments of enemy capabilities and morale. The siege of Vicksburg was demonstrating how intelligence could be integrated into military operations to achieve maximum effectiveness. As June progressed, the intelligence reports from within Vicksburg painted an increasingly desperate picture of Confederate prospects. The combination of physical deprivation, psychological pressure, and military isolation was creating conditions that made the city's surrender increasingly inevitable. The question was no longer whether Vicksburg would fall, but when and under what circumstances. The morning of July 4, 1863, dawned with an unusual silence over the Vicksburg battlefield, but the quiet was deceptive. Behind the scenes, the most intensive intelligence operations of the siege were reaching their climax as Confederate resistance finally began to collapse under the weight of comprehensive Union espionage and psychological warfare. Emma Edmonds, transmitting what would prove to be her final intelligence reports from within Confederate lines, described a city where military discipline was disintegrating and civilian suffering had reached unbearable levels. The intelligence network that had guided Grant's campaign from its inception now faced its ultimate test, determining the exact timing and conditions of Vicksburg's surrender. Lieutenant Colonel Wilson's staff had developed multiple scenarios based on intelligence assessments of Confederate morale, supply conditions, and command effectiveness. The accuracy of these predictions would determine whether the siege ended in negotiated surrender or costly assault. Charles Davis, operating under increasingly dangerous conditions within the Confederate perimeter, reported that General Pemberton was facing growing pressure from both his military commanders and civilian leaders to negotiate terms with Grant. The intelligence revealed that Confederate ammunition supplies, while not completely exhausted, were insufficient for sustained resistance against a determined Union assault. More importantly, the will to continue fighting was evaporating throughout the Confederate garrison. The psychological warfare operations that had been conducted throughout the siege reached their culmination in early July. Union intelligence operatives, working through Confederate deserters and civilian contacts, had systematically undermined Confederate confidence in their ability to hold the city. The carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological pressure had created conditions where surrender became preferable to continued resistance. African American intelligence operatives provided crucial information about the final negotiations between Confederate and Union representatives. Their access to Confederate headquarters and their ability to observe high-level discussions gave Grant's staff detailed intelligence about Confederate negotiating positions and the internal debates that preceded the surrender decision. This intelligence advantage ensured that Union negotiators entered the surrender talks with comprehensive knowledge of Confederate intentions and limitations. The surrender of Vicksburg on July 4, 1863, represented the culmination of the most sophisticated intelligence operation of the American Civil War, the network of spies, scouts, and informants that had guided Grant's army from the Louisiana bayous to the gates of the Gibraltar of the Confederacy had achieved a victory that was as much intellectual as military. Emma Edmonds, finally able to abandon her dangerous masquerade, emerged from Confederate lines with intelligence that confirmed the completeness of the Union victory. Her reports documented not just the military surrender, but the psychological collapse that had made resistance impossible. The civilian population, the military garrison, and the Confederate command structure had all been systematically undermined by the comprehensive intelligence operations that had accompanied the physical siege. The intelligence lessons learned during the Vicksburg campaign would influence military operations for generations to come. The systematic integration of espionage, reconnaissance, psychological warfare, and signals intelligence had created a new model for conducting complex military operations. The success of Grant's campaign demonstrated that modern warfare required comprehensive intelligence preparation and continuous intelligence support throughout all phases of operations. Lieutenant Colonel Wilson's final intelligence assessment of the Vicksburg campaign documented the contribution of hundreds of individuals whose names would never appear in official military histories. The African American scouts and spies, the civilian informants, the Confederate deserters and double agents, and the Union operatives who had risked their lives to gather crucial intelligence, had made possible one of the most significant victories of the Civil War. The fall of Vicksburg marked the beginning of the end for the Confederacy, but it also marked the emergence of intelligence operations as a decisive factor in modern warfare. The comprehensive spy network that had made Grant's victory possible represented a new level of sophistication in military intelligence that would influence the development of intelligence services throughout the world. The complete documentation of these intelligence operations was compiled in the post-war period through interviews with surviving operatives and analysis of captured Confederate documents, as preserved in the official records and the archives of the War Department. As the Confederate garrison marched out of Vicksburg in formal surrender, the Union intelligence operatives who had made their victory possible remained largely anonymous. Their contribution to the Union cause would be recognized only gradually, as historians began to understand the crucial role that intelligence had played in determining the outcome of the Civil War's most important siege. The intelligence war that had been fought in the shadows of the Vicksburg campaign had demonstrated that information was as powerful as ammunition in determining military success. The spies, scouts, and operatives who had served in this invisible army had earned their place among the heroes of the Union victory, even if their names were destined to be forgotten by a grateful nation that never fully understood the scope of their sacrifices and achievements.